I can't wait to get started. If you are in a marriage that might have some trouble, sorry, but you can also want to tune in because Dr. Russ Berg is going to be with us. And if you are wanting to know how to respond to a couple that might be struggling, that's a good thing, too, because you can call and ask a question. How to be a first responder to a marriage that's in trouble, and what skills do we need as fellow Christians and church leaders to support marriages in practice as well as in principle. We'll take a short break and be back. Good morning. It's 20 minutes until the top of the hour. I think everybody has, at some point, a fairly significant struggle with their marriage, whether it's a season or a long season. But Dr. Russ Berg has a ministry called HopeForTheHurtingHome.com, and he's been married to his high school sweetie, Melody, for 41 years. He was a pastor for 36 years, and now he really wants to help people with marriages that are in trouble. If you have one today or you want to ask Russ a question, give us a call, 1-877-933-2484, or you can email me, Bill, at myfaithradio.com. Russ, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks, Bill. Thanks. You forgot been married 41 years. Melody said it's the 30 happiest years of our life. I forgot to put that on the bio.
So every married couple has got their season of difficulty. I had a listener today write in and say, in anticipation of you being on the air, that, she's in a period where a lot of her friends have marriages now in about their 20th year, and they have expectations that are just not really maybe being met. It's like a dream. Maybe if you've had a dream that you would have a long career that it maybe didn't come to fruition. Maybe the kids didn't turn out the way you hoped. Maybe financially you're not where you think you'd want to be or you thought you'd be. Or maybe the relationship just isn't as fulfilling as you would expect after such a long investment in a relationship.
Yeah. I think sometimes we need to remember that the person we're married to today is not the person we married. That we change as people. I think a lot of times, too, the dreams that we have are sometimes more influenced by our own needs and the cultural voices that, everybody ought to be married to a 10 or at least a solid 8.9. And when we kind of fall below that, we can begin to focus on the 10 or 15% in our relationship that maybe has fallen short and lose sight of the fact that during that investment of years and time and energy and memories and oftentimes children, the 85% is really worth living for and worth protecting. But we can become, really focused on the negative or the part that's not what we had hoped for. Sometimes, too, you need to grieve the death of a dream for you to enter into a new season of marriage where you are right now, where you and your spouse are right now.
Russ, say more about that, about the death of a dream.
Paul Tripp wrote a book that really impacted me. I've got the title wrong, but it's something like God's Grace in Midlife. And there's a chapter in there, and this particularly hit me the season I was in, where he said sometimes we realize that more of our life is in the rearview mirror than ahead of us. And we feel like we're in the autumn of our life, standing in a pile of leaves of regret with no dream for the future. And his counsel and advice was, we get to a place in our life where, let's say Mel and I have, we've experienced this at different times. So, after being married, actually it's going to be 43 years in October, so the bio's a little old. We realize there are things that we are not going to accomplish or not going to experience, either because of life season, of finances, health, and that we need to be able to grieve those things that are not going to happen in order for us to embrace what does God want us to experience together as a couple for the next season of marriage that's ahead of us, for the next 10 or 12 years. Oftentimes I think people end up wasting years of their life hoping and praying and dreaming of a life they're never going to have, and they let slip through their hands. The great country western theologian Eddie Rabbitt had that song, What's Forever for a number of years ago. It says, I see love-hungry people trying their best to survive. And right there in their hands is a dying romance, and they're not even trying to keep it alive. We become focused on the dream we wanted to have or the marriage we thought we deserve, rather than really cultivating and working at the marriage that God's given to us.
Very interesting, Russ. So talk about how expectations, how they're formed and what happens to them and what's worth going for and then what you have to let go of.
Sure. Well, there's a little bit different rabbit trail, but this is really interesting to me because I've been thinking a lot about it. Andy Stanley has a video called iMarriage. It's on YouTube. People can see it. It's a great 3-part series. But in there, he talks about how all of us come into marriage with desires. We can't help it. This is, we're wired this way. Our first marriages, we've never done this before. All we have are our dreams. But our desires about marriage are shaped by 2 very powerful things. One, how has God wired us? So our personalities determine a lot of this. But secondly, they're shaped by how we were raised, how we saw marriage being lived out, either in a healthy way or in an unhealthy way. And when desires are unmet, they become expectations. And we start hearing phrases like, I just thought you knew this is what a wife should do. This is what a husband ought to be doing. When expectations are unmet, they morph into demands. And so we start getting on each other's back instead of on each other's team. When demands are unmet in seasons of marriage, they become ultimatums. I won't live with a person who does this. And we begin to then create that bottom line thing, I can't live with this, and then we fill in the blank.
This is really interesting, Russ. I also want to take a very short break to allow listeners, if they'd like to call in and ask a question to Dr. Russ Berg, to do so at 1-877-933-2484. You can also email me, Bill at myfaithradio.com, if you'd like to ask your question in the form of an email because you don't want to come on the air. I'll ask it for you. How's that? It's 14 minutes until the top of the hour. We'll be right back with more with Dr. Russ Berg from Hope for the Hurting Home. 12 minutes until the top of the hour. Bill Arnold here. I'm talking to Dr. Russ Berg from Hope for the Hurting Home. That's hopeforthehurtinghome.com if you want to learn a little bit more about that. We're talking about marriages that can and be in trouble, that are in trouble, and also how you can be a first responder for marriages that are in trouble. You want to show up on the scene. What's the best thing to do? Russ, a listener wrote in and said, what should I do when a spouse is verbally abusive? How to deal with a spouse's chronic anger?
Yeah, I'm glad you shot me. And maybe this is the second. It's a very, very common thing. So this could have been the second thing that got sent in. But so I did a little bit of thinking about this last night. Verbal abuse and chronic anger. I want to be really careful here because there's 2 sides of the coin. One, and probably 2 directions we can go in that can lead to extremes that aren't helpful. One is we can deny that something is as bad as it is. Something that really needs help, it really needs attention. And these are what we call hard reasons for marital distress. They almost all begin with the letter A. Abuse, abandonment, addictions, adultery. Those are things that no one should have to live with. They're not immediate reasons for divorce. But what they do indicate is a hard reason means that this marital distress, the source of it, is residing in the behavior of one person. There may be reasons why it's easy. So, for example, if I'm struggling with an addiction, there may be factors in our home that enable my addiction or make it easier. But that addiction is always my choice. It's never Melody's fault that I make unhealthy choices or that I'm chronically angry. The other end of the coin, though, is that we are a society of labels. We want to fix things. We want to understand things. We don't like ambiguity. And so if we can put a label on a problem or a person, oftentimes it can give us an excuse for not examining our contributions to why that might be so. So I just came up with a couple things. I don't know if these are helpful, but kind of a combination of things that either I've been working with people on or reading about. You know, one, I think we need loving boundaries. We need fences, not walls. And there's, you know, Towns has written a lot about, there's a lot of good books on Cloud and Towns on their books on boundaries. Mm-hmm. But I think I've noticed a lot of people who have read those books, and for them, boundaries are walls. They are de facto things that happen in the relationship that are not going to let you get through, rather than fences that delineate where does my responsibility stop and yours stop. Your start. Sometimes, too, we need to go back to Jim Dobson's concept of tough love. We need to make sure that we're not enabling chronic behavior, but we're also not setting up entrapment for chronic behavior. Sometimes we can get into a cycle where we believe our spouse cannot change, and so either intentionally or unintentionally, we set up buttons that we push that kind of reinforce the narrative that, see, my spouse is, and then we fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. I think the second thing I would encourage people to do is just, with the loving boundaries, I just want to go back to that for a second. We need to take seriously any kind of behavior that puts at risk a family's, physical or emotional safety. And we need to take that very seriously. We're not encouraging people to stay in destructive or harmful relationships. But having said that, I think both parties, and especially the person that's maybe struggling with the spouse that has a chronic issue, is we need to have honest ownership of what do I contribute. And let me give you an example. We tell people there's good math to relationships, and we tell them to remember the numbers 2 and 4. I'm responsible to people, to love them, serve them, sacrifice for them, be there for them, but I'm not responsible for them. God's responsible ultimately for them, and they're ultimately responsible for their own behavior. So there are times when, and I've seen this in husbands and wives, where a person is described as having chronic anger. It could be childhood issues. It could be issues in the dynamic of the marriage where it's this thing that we call pursuer distancer. We call it the woodpecker and the turtle. One person likes flight, and the other person likes to fight. And so sometimes the person who's been pecking, I need a response. We're going to have this argument. Just talk to me. Sometimes they actually encourage, by their behavior, by their personality type, they actually encourage the kind of angry response that's just a turtle saying, leave me alone. And you do need professional help for that, because there's two sets of contributions to that. There are never excuses for destructive behavior, but there are really gifted counselors that can help you understand the dynamics and begin to change the dance a little bit at a time. I think third thing, for people who are in these really, really painful relationships, ask God for compassion and not contempt. Most of us who work with people who are struggling we're familiar with the phrase, hurt people hurt people. And I've run into many spouses where, unfortunately, the one spouse is the recipient of the chronic verbal abuse or chronic anger, but they have no clue what tools were put in or left out of the toolbox of their spouse when they married them. They're oftentimes not aware of their spouse's narrative of what's going on at work, things that might be contributing because of a previous marriage. And these are not excuses, but they're really important windows of empathy that I have found when a spouse that's married to someone who's struggling with one of these hard reasons has more compassion than contempt. Oftentimes that spouse that needs professional help is more willing to go because they don't feel the rejection or the condemnation of their spouse that doesn't have the issue. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it makes a ton of sense.
And then I think another thing I wrote down here, I give most of the clients that I work with, I give them a picture of, it's actually taken out of Luke 15, Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal. It's a very famous painting, and I took it off the internet, and someone said you can't get in trouble if you take it off the internet. But if it's on the internet, that might not be true. But we have them printed off, and it's a very famous painting, and it has all the characters of Luke 15. The father, and the father's holding the prodigal who's returned, and then there's the older brother standing off to the side. And we have people put this on we have them printed off, put on the refrigerator, and ask themselves 3 questions when they walk by it. One, am I more like the Father today, giving grace? Am I more like the prodigal who screwed up, who's in need of grace, in need of forgiveness? Or am I more like the older brother who's withholding grace?
Wow. Russ, it's such a delight to have you on the show, and I do want to have you back. This conversation must continue. There's other callers that would like to get on, so maybe we can do this again soon.
Love to do that. And sorry about the mix-up today.
No problem, Russ. Thanks.
Supposed to be on earlier.
Thanks so much. Have a great day. It's 3 minutes until the top of the hour. We'll take a short break and then wrap up the show.